local communities in the global north and the global south, which are resisting the mining projects, even in the EU, where there are numerous mining projects being planned, they're basically being completely left to their own devices. And oftentimes the far right just comes in and completely exploits this sense of betrayal that they're experiencing. And it's the climate activists and environmental organizations that have really struggled to come up with a coherent position on the issue of mining. And I have really seen so many organizations staying silent on lithium mining because they still believe or still say that we need some lithium for the green transition. And I agree that we need some lithium for the green transition, but opening more and more mines is not the solution. And the worst thing is that opening more mines is not going to close the existing ones.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Nina Djukanović. Nina is doing her PhD at the University of Oxford, researching green extractivism and resistance to lithium mining in local communities. She's also a climate analyst at the Association for International Affairs, a think tank based in Prague, for whom she wrote the report Material Dependencies, analysing the competitiveness, security, and socio-environmental issues of critical raw materials around the world. I invited Nina on to discuss this report because it's one of the best things I've read all year, how our increasing material footprint is causing havoc ecologically, sociopolitically, and how transitioning to a renewable economy isn't going to solve the problem. In fact, it's going to exacerbate existing problems. In the report, Nina explains how we simply do not have enough materials to transition to a renewable economy in the way that it's currently being discussed around the world. She looks at how mining as an extractive industry is changing geopolitics around the world, worsening existing conflicts, and leading to heightened militarization. She also looks at digitisation, the rise of AI, and how despite being intertwined as a solution, the digital transition and the green transition, they are fundamentally incompatible because both require huge amounts of critical raw materials. And if we want to adequately materially invest in low carbon technologies, then we simply cannot dig up the earth to grow our digital economy. Nina explains all this and more on the episode. She is such a great communicator, tying everything I've just said into genocide, war, the rise of authoritarianism, and really revealing the sort of moral vacuity that undergirds the EU's climate policies, let alone Trump's. And her message is clear. A sustainable world will never be built with the violence of extractivism. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who keep the project going every week. Now, I met you last year in 2024, about a year and a half ago, at a conference that was being put on in the Czech Republic that was about sort of, the materiality of the world and our material resources and what are we going to do about it, and China. And it was incredibly interesting. Essentially out of that conference, plus a whole amount of other resources, because I've read your paper and I've read your bibliography, and it paints a very frightening picture of the world, something that will be relevant and known to Planet Critical listeners, that essentially moving to a renewable well, because I know that would have been a mammoth piece of work. And I'm going to link the paper so that people can read it when they want to and take their own notes. But what are some of the key takeaways from it?
Mm. Thanks so much, Rachel. It really means a lot to hear someone actually reading the paper and engaging with it so deeply. Um, so yeah, thank you for that. As for the key takeaways, I mean, I agree that it paints a pretty dark picture, but I also think that it at least tries to show a clear path forward, which is maybe not clear in a way that it's well defined, but I think that by being very clear about what we are not supposed to do or what should not be the way to go forward, we can sort of start to imagine a different kind of way to go forward and a different kind of world. I would say that one of the main ideas behind the paper was really to link these three aspects which are often thought about in complete isolation, which is competitiveness, security, and socio-environmental issues connected to mining of critical raw materials. What was interesting to me over the years was really seeing how the discourse around the so-called critical raw materials has been changing. So whereas in the past few years they were really portrayed as this sort of essential element for the green transition, as something that we really need. There was this picture that lithium goes into batteries, which goes into electric vehicles, and without that there is not going to be any green transition. Whereas that was the case just a few years ago, what we're seeing now is that the discourse is very much changing. And there is a sort of a shift much more focused on competitiveness, industrial policy, things like that, especially on the EU level. Then that then that happens at the same time with a massive securitization and militarization, which has been kind of in the focus since the war in Ukraine, but even more so now, since in the past few months, since the elections of Donald Trump, which basically had a major effect also on the EU level and the EU policies. My worry is that the EU policies very much mimic that of Donald Trump and many other far-right leaders. The EU as a whole is turning towards the right very fast, not only in terms of nationalism and patriotism and horrible approaches to migration, but also very much in terms of just complete deregulation of environmental protection and anything related to that. And that becomes really obvious when we zoom into this question of critical raw materials. Some of the main issues that I think we are facing when we think about how they're going to be used or how they're projected to be used is really that the demand growth is at the scale that I think is hard to imagine. Even if we just stayed at the level of the green transition, for all of the electric vehicles to become electric, there's basically serious doubt that it's even possible, that there's even enough resources in the entire world for that to happen. Even if that was theoretically possible, the environmental consequences would be completely devastating. So that is one thing. And that is not to talk about the ways in which these materials are now being used increasingly in digital technologies and militarization. And what is the most problematic aspect is that there's basically no prioritization in the legislation as to for what use is this material that is being mined actually going to be used. So those are some of the main issues, and of course that is very much connected to the ways in which local communities are now resisting the mining projects that are happening there. And I think all of that actually creates more insecurity rather than security, because it's the local communities who are typically the least responsible for the climate crisis that are now being asked to make this massive sacrifice and accept more mining projects in their regions, and they're being forced to move out, move away, and obviously that leads to more conflicts and resistance. So while we often get this picture painted by the EU that mining raw materials is going to lead to a more secure world, more competitiveness, and tackling the climate crisis, actually what's happening is the very opposite of that.
What a phenomenal overview, Nina. Thank you so, so, so much. there's probably a couple of threads that we should try and go down independently and then weave them all together. The first is this change in the discourse that you mentioned. And from what I can understand of this, it's that previously there was this kind of assumption, essentially, that the free markets would be able to provide whatever it was that industries needed, to the point that actually I remember a couple of academics talking about this about 4 years ago, that estimates with regards to lithium deposits or cobalt deposits were being done with regards to free market mechanisms of economics, not actual scientific analysis of what was in the ground. And now, thanks to the rise of authoritarianism, thanks to the United States, the EU, the United States, these big political blocs are trying to ensure that they have their hands on their own supply chains, which is going to create a form of actual old style colonialism rather than the economic neocolonialism that we've been witnessing around the world. And it does seem that they're pretty late. I mean, was it China controls about 95% of the supply chains for critical raw materials? So I'm not entirely sure how any of these political blocs envision sort of clawing back enough space to be relevant in the coming decades. But it's definitely what is sort of the political priority at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's interesting that you say that they're being late because that's very much how it feels.
Mm.
China is controlling the majority of the critical raw materials, not only mining and processing, but also the end technologies such as the batteries that we use. So here I think the example of Donald Trump is a really good one, even though I don't want to give him too much space. I think he, as a person, really shows that he is a leader who um, has very openly denied climate change, fired many scientists, has nothing to do with the green transition. His policies are even going in the opposite direction, undoing much of the things that were done before. And still, mining and extractivism and the control of the supply chains is very much a priority to him. I think that really shows how these things are interconnected and how mining of the so-called critical raw materials does not necessarily mean that they're going to be used for the green transition. What is crucial here is really to ask ourselves, what are we going to use these materials for? Is there any prioritization as to how are they going to be used? And most importantly, to really make sure that the resources that we're using are having as little impact as possible because the overconsumption is so great that we really need to focus on actually reducing that consumption and prioritizing the use when it's necessary. The example of Trump is really important also in a geopolitical sense. He has tried to ramp up mining within the US as well. He signed an executive order in spring, which basically says that on all federal lands, which includes national parks, if there is found to be enough of resources of interest that basically overrides the existing legislation, including the protection of national parks, which itself is the very idea behind the national parks. Then, of course, with the infamous deal of Ukraine, Ukraine was basically forced into giving up on its resources in exchange for Trump's continuous military support in this extremely unfair and unjust deal that has received very little scrutiny because it was very much seen as something that Ukraine doesn't really have a choice here. Similarly, with open threats to annex Greenland, I think his statements have been very evident of the fact that mining is a priority and the control of the supply chains is a priority. And I think for us, it's very important to pay attention to this and to sort of make sure that we understand what are these discourses actually saying and to really scrutinize any discussion that is going on mining because it so often just becomes painted green through many greenwashing narratives that are just being used for promoting more of violent and militarized mining regimes.
I think the fact that the renewable transition, quote unquote, has sort of come historically from the left wing and from an environmental movement that was incredibly intersectional. and also perceived a world with a different kind of technology and fuel source as being more peaceful, healthier, more secure as well for its citizens. And so they're sort of using that narrative of the world being securer in order to push through mining, which, as you say, may not even be used for the quote unquote green transition, may go into any number of the different industries that need these critical raw materials, which we will also get into later in this episode. But obviously, this is a complete misnomer because the fact of mining is an incredibly violent thing, not just against Earth's body herself, but also against the people who are forced into giving over their lands, who are displaced, and who then have to suffer also the downstream consequences, whether that's fresh water sources no longer being viable, soils being polluted. And it triggers a huge amount of violence as well within local communities. Violence is something that trickles down, unlike our economic system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that is so important and that unfortunately has really taken a while for many of the Western climate activists to understand.
Yeah.
I have a lot of sympathy for that because I understand that people have been fighting for years for anything to happen. As we were saying before, the struggle really was to convince anyone that something has to be done. Now the question really is, what is it that is being done, and is this actually good enough? And I had a really fascinating conversation with someone from Extinction Rebellion Serbia as part of my research on resistance to lithium mining in Serbia, who are very much supporting the local community against lithium mining. But they were saying that there is this massive rift between XR Serbia and XR Germany, which spent years basically fighting for electric vehicles to become supported as a solution. So I really have a lot of sympathy for that because I think it takes a lot of courage to admit that we were fighting for something which actually turned out to be a false solution and not a real systemic change. But that is really where we need to be because as things are standing now, we're seeing that these technologies are really just a continuation of exactly what you were saying, a violent and colonial system that is not being changed at all.
And this isn't metaphorical. I mean, at that same conference where we met, Olivia Lazard was speaking, and a lot of her work has been on tracking socio-political violence that is triggered by extractive industries and by the presence of mining, whether that's creating new conflicts or exacerbating new conflicts. And so when we think about security, geopolitical security, the idea that it can be achieved through the continuation of a consistent fuel supply via ramping up a hugely extractive and violent industry is nothing short of delusional, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to also focus on how security became one of the main issues of the past. I would even say months, not even years.
Yeah.
You can really feel it how the atmosphere has changed in the world. Suddenly, security is the main thing, and suddenly we all have to ramp up our arms production and really militarize with the infamous 5% of GDP spent for defense NATO initiative. I think it's important to also understand that in a way, I also have a sympathy for that because people, of course, feel insecure because they see all the violence that is going on in the world. But in a way, it's really, again, this, I would almost say, a betrayal from the states and companies which use this emotion that is very real. They produce fear itself in the communities and population, very much to the advantage of the far right, which is basically thriving on people's fear. They use all of this to produce more violence, not less. So rather than de-escalating and rather than really looking at solutions which are focused on less conflict and less violence, not only within communities, but also with nature and environment, rather than doing that, the direction is complete opposite, but actually exploiting these very real feelings.
Yeah, well said. Thank you very much. We are witnessing such a horrific rise of political violence all around the world. And the fact that it comes through, exactly as you say, these discourses of security is just, it's very sad that we're still falling for it at this stage. Nina, something that's so interesting about this focus on critical raw materials, and what another part of the discourse that has changed in the last year, 18 months max, has been the introduction of artificial intelligence and the massive hyper growth of artificial intelligence, and the fact that digital technologies are now expected to soak up a huge amount of the supply chain of these critical raw materials. And so far, the analysis hasn't really extended to include both. So when I read reports about critical raw materials now for renewable technologies, authors are saying, beware. This doesn't even include all of the sort of superfluous uses of these critical raw materials, and that's where everything is being directed towards, to this digitization. We don't know if we have enough for both. We definitely actually probably don't have enough for both. But what we do know is that it's AI is taking away from any renewable future that could have been envisioned easily 2 years ago.
Yeah, really a great question. What is fascinating to me is that these are so clearly incompatible. You cannot have the growth of AI to the extent that it's currently being projected, even though we have to understand that all of these projections are really fundamentally imperfect and unreliable. But much more in a way that we can't even imagine to what extent that is going to grow, especially supported not only by companies but by governments, which are very much trying to, again, continue this race to the bottom of innovation and technology. So I think it's obvious that these things are actually fundamentally incompatible. You cannot have a massive increase in AI technologies. You cannot have a massive increase in militarization. What these two things have in common is that we really lack sufficient information to even understand how polluting that is. Famously, the US Army, the biggest one in the world, is not publishing its carbon footprint. We have no idea how polluting these technologies actually are. These things are fundamentally incompatible with tackling the climate crisis, but they're very much being portrayed as not only compatible, but actually interlinked. And they are interlinked in a way, but you really see on the EU level that the green and the digital transition is being nicknamed twin transition as something that really is intimately linked, and that you basically can't have one without the other. But to me, the key question is, if you link the two things, then which one then becomes a priority? And how do you actually deal with the tensions that are obviously there? You really have to have a clear prioritization of what is actually the biggest thing that we need to focus on right now. And I really believe that the biggest thing that we need to focus on right now is the climate crisis and the related violence across the world. And unfortunately, that is not happening at all.
I think it's a very thinly veiled mask, this push for digitization, because the EU and also the Western world generally, within a capitalist system, has failed to produce a hyper growth market since, well, I don't know, maybe the smartphone in tech. And other than that, I'm not really sure. And so data is the new oil. And the more people there are, the more data there is. There will always be more data points. And so I do think that it's a thinly veiled mask to essentially continue generating increasing GDP by selling off our data to private companies, whilst the economy generally around us is crumbling and failing to produce living standards or the necessary infrastructure that people need to live. And the fact of tying it into the climate crisis is a incredibly malicious, I would say, actually maligned subterfuge against the citizens of the European Union and the world more widely. Because this line that I keep seeing over and over and over again, that digitization is a form of dematerialization, that this is how we're going to reduce our material footprint. This is how we're going to use less resources by putting everything in the cloud. It's a lie. It's a barefaced lie. Digitization carries a huge material footprint.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, it's such an interesting thing, just imaginatively, it's such a powerful image of a cloud that is just floating in the sky. And I mean, I really think that the way we think about digital is totally, completely disconnected from the reality of it is that we really picture it as something immaterial, when in fact all of the clouds are very much deeply rooted in minds which are existing and expanding, having catastrophical impacts on the environment. And that is just something that I think most of us choose to ignore. And the governing structures have been very successful in exploiting that. Even though I have to say that I do think that most of the people have understood that the green transition, as it has been dominantly envisioned based on these techno fixes and based on digitalization, is not going to happen. The main issue is that this realization has been largely co-opted by the climate deniers and the far right. And then what happens, and what is one of my greatest concerns, is really that these local communities in the global north and the global south, which are resisting the mining projects, even in the EU, where there are numerous mining projects being planned, they're basically being completely left to their own devices. And oftentimes the far right just comes in and completely exploits this sense of betrayal that they're experiencing. And it's the climate activists and environmental organizations that have really struggled to come up with a coherent position on the issue of mining. And I have really seen so many organizations staying silent on lithium mining because they still believe or still say that we need some lithium for the green transition. And I agree that we need some lithium for the green transition, but opening more and more mines is not the solution. And the worst thing is that opening more mines is not going to close the existing ones. What you sometimes hear that perhaps in a way mining in Europe or in the global north might even be decolonial in a sense. And I completely agree with the fact that the current system is extremely colonial and the global north is extremely dependent on the global south. But unfortunately, opening more mines in the global north is not going to lead to closure of any mines in the global south. This idea, this extractivism as a system is just continuously expanding. And that's the only thing that, that the system knows how to do, this continuous economic growth. And I think we really need to look at this very critically and resist it basically.
Yeah. I completely agree with you that essentially we have created a bit of a vacuum for the far right to come in and create populist narratives out of people's sort of either intuitive or lived suspicion of the rhetoric surrounding the green transition. I think especially when it's being portrayed as a don't worry too much about everything that's going on. We'll just swap out one thing for another, and then you can just continue your life. And a lot of people's lives are just not very good at the moment. And so they don't want to continue that, especially when a continuation looks like a worsening into a future that is incredibly unclear. And I'm amazed that still there are an interesting mainstream narratives around what we could do or where we could get minerals from. I mean, I write this in my book, which I've just finished the first draft. But I'm like, melt things down. There are so many materials already existing on the planet. The weight of dead things, of man-made civilization, outweighs the weight of living things on the planet. There are buildings that we could melt down. Sorry, guys, but there are churches that we could melt down. There's lots of gold in the Vatican. No, but really, there's lots of minerals that currently exist. And this isn't necessarily just a kind of a recycling or a donut economy in which we take that which we are producing and put it in. But we really should be thinking about what is it that we can dig up from our history and turn into our future? And how is it that we can use the fact that we have educated populations to make considered collective decisions about what we think is good or necessary or futile, and then say, well, that's not really serving any decent purpose. So let's take the materials from that industry, dismantle it, and put it into, the technologies that we do need. I just think of about once a week, I think of the fact that there's these CBDs, these central business districts in major cities around the world, which are these monstrous glass and steel and iron buildings that are vacuous, morally empty, producing nothing except wealth for a very, very few. And that's a huge material footprint that could be melted down and put into the requisite infrastructure for people to live.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And not even from history. I mean, just looking at the amount of digital waste
Yeah.
already existing. I mean, that's something I'm really fascinated by. Is this fascinated not in a good way?
Yeah.
Is just the
Morbidly.
entire push behind electric vehicles.
Yeah.
Um, it's just, I don't know, it's just mind blowing to me. We already have electric vehicles which lasted for a few years and are now, piling up at the garbage dumps, basically. It's really extremely wasteful, and the entire system, I would say, is extremely inefficient in a way, which is funny because efficiency is often being used as a discourse by many of these well, I want to say people who are fans of techno fixes and things like that. But
Yeah.
the very solutions that they're proposing are extremely inefficient. Just looking at the example of transport, which I think is a very interesting example, it is the only sector in the EU's economy where the carbon emissions have not decreased at all since the 90s. Every other sector has managed to have at least some decrease. And of course, we can talk about many of that being thanks to externalization
Yeah.
of the carbon emissions and all of that. But still, the transport sector has really grew. And the proposed solution to that are electric vehicles, which are extremely inefficient as a solution. I mean, if you really had to picture that you have a world full of people where millions, if not billions, have to go to work and come back every day. It's a world full of movement, and you have to come up with the most efficient system to transport people with the least amount of resources and emissions, which is the definition of efficiency. And the proposed solutions are these massive boxes on four wheels, which typically have only one person driving them,
Yeah.
that require insane amount of resources. That
Yeah.
is just such an inefficient system to come up
Yeah.
with, and that's the dominant system.
Yeah.
And so one thing that I think is really important that you were also saying, Rachel, is really going back to this idea of tackling overconsumption, which I don't know if you agree, because it's just something that that I feel. I don't have anything to prove it, but I really feel like this discourse was much stronger before. There was this idea that we are going to have to change our lifestyles for the climate crisis to be tackled, that, you have to tighten your belts. It's something that you have to do. We just have to deal with it. And to me, that has almost completely disappeared. Now, the dominant discourse is that actually you don't have to change your lifestyles. You can just keep consuming and buy a different car. And you can have this, utopian vision of techno futuristic green world, which I'm just very skeptical is possible.
That's such a good point. I hadn't really thought about it, but yes, I suppose that has happened. And again, probably due to the rise of authoritarianism over the past 15, especially 10 years in the EU, whereby the climate movement has become associated with anti-freedom, anti-choice, even anti-democracy. So at the moment, the United Kingdom is pushing through digital IDs. And the amount of rhetoric I have seen online of, we have to say no to this, which I agree, because they're going to start tracking our carbon emissions and they'll start denying people the right to buy meat, let alone take a flight, depending on their own annual carbon footprint. And I saw it so much, it proliferated online, that I went, well, I'm going to go and have a look and see if this has been discussed at all, Of course it hasn't, because you can't discuss something like that so openly in a country like the United Kingdom. But that's where people have got landed to. And it's amazing how quickly it's gone there, given it has absolutely nothing to do, really nothing to do with the climate crisis, this. And I think it's because this idea of responsibility became a narrative of asceticism and then lack, scarcity, lacking, anti-democratic, essentially, Stalinist Russia. That's where we've gotten to. So I think that's why the techno narrative then came in and said, don't worry, you can have luxury green communism. It's going to be even better than before. And I genuinely am not sure how we counter the the fallacy, the fact of those two narratives and the friction between them, and the fact that we kind of exist somewhere in between, where it's going to be neither. We are going to have to give things up. But wouldn't it be nice if you had to give up your, shitty 9 to 5 job that produces just waste for the planet and gives you mental health issues? But that's an imaginative ceiling that a lot of people can't reach, and rightly so. They've been told, don't even dare dream about that.
Yeah. Yeah, so many interesting points. I guess to me, it really is also, I think it maybe comes down to the fact that so many people, even in the global north, I mean, as you're saying, don't live good lives. And the idea that they would have to be even worse off, even for the sake of green transition, feels fundamentally unjust to them. And frankly, I think they're completely right. We so often ask the most vulnerable ones, the ones who are least responsible for the climate crisis, to make the biggest sacrifices. It's even rural communities in Europe that really, I mean, live lives that we would consider to be very quote unquote sustainable, farming on their own plots of lands. These are the people that are now being asked to move away for a mining project to take place. And any sort of carbon tax, which would target population as the whole, I really find to be unjust, because it's not like we don't know who's the most responsible for the mess in which we are. It's really, the most polluting companies, the top 1%. And I think that the main issue is that that's not where we're starting from. I think you could start from the top 1% and then sort of go down to everyone else. But really, if you're asking people to, I don't know, do all of these things which would impact negatively their lives, which are already difficult, but you won't even introduce a wealth tax, a minimum wealth tax, I find it to be incredibly problematic, and something that the far right is exactly using up, because they can just go in and say that, it's actually migrants who are to blame, or someone else, or the communists. But really, the issue is that the alternatives that are being offered to the majority of the population are simply unjust. And I think that without social justice, a really serious social justice, we can't even talk about the green transition, because of course people are going to be against that. You can convince them that it's going to be for the good thing to save the planet, but they're not stupid. We know it's not. We actually know for a fact that these things are now being used more to promote militarization and, as you were saying, all of these digital innovations, rather than actually better lives for most of the planet.
So, given your research on the materials that we have, how they're being used, etc., what could we do? I mean, what would a renewable, degrown future look like for people? What's actually materially feasible?
One thing that I really argue for is basically reintroducing or refocusing on this concept of sufficiency, which is basically the idea that there is an imaginative threshold of how much energy or resources you need to live a good life. And basically, what is happening with this idea of sufficiency is that it can be used to really promote, as you said, degrowth, but a degrowth of only certain parts of economy. I think it's really important to understand that even in a degrowth scenario, some things would grow. Of course, probably things like a care sector, or exactly a sector focused on the green transition, but some things would need to degrow. Essentially, it's very similar to this idea that we need to tackle overconsumption. And I think that what we need to do is basically start talking about what is this level of consumption that is acceptable for good lives across the world. Because, of course, some populations will still need to grow and should be allowed to develop. And I think a huge misunderstanding of degrowth proposals is that they would not allow for other countries to develop or to grow. I think that it really isn't that complicated. We can even move away from the national borders, which I find sometimes to be too simplistic. You can focus on the top 1% or the top 10% across the planet because, of course, one thing that I really like as a saying is that you always have a global south within the global north, and you always have the
Yes.
global north within the global south.
Yes.
And I think one really important thing is also to move away from the binaries, which are not
Yes.
necessarily capturing the complexity. So I think the binary between the global north and the global south is extremely important as long as we understand that it's not clear cut and that it's fluid and there's still many spaces in between. And one of those spaces in between that I find very interesting is the Balkans as sort of being in Europe but not in the EU, sort of occupying this liminal position in between. But to come back to the idea of sufficiency, I think that really needs to be the starting point to ask ourselves very seriously, what are the materials that we need? How much energy do we need for a good life? How can we arrange that in the most efficient, but actually efficient and systematic way, and also in the most just way? So that includes what you were saying, recycling, going back to all of the materials that we use. We can even use the concept of circular economy, even though I'm worried that it has been largely co-opted exactly by these techno-optimistic, techno-fix forces. I think circular economy as a concept is great as long as we understand that you actually cannot have a circle without the degrowth. You can't have a circle
Yeah.
that keeps growing forever. You can't have a circle that also accounts for the massive rise of the AI, as we were saying before. Maybe using AI as an example as well. I think that's a good example. I don't think it's realistic to say that we have to ban AI and that it's not going to, that we can't have it at all. But if there is this technology, why don't we ask ourselves really seriously, how can it be used for the ways that would increase the well-being of the highest number of population? Why doesn't that focus just on healthcare, for example, on actually tackling climate crisis? Instead, what is it being used for is creating crazy deepfake videos that are really manipulating population to an extent that really worries me. So yeah, I think those are some of the examples that can be used as a starting point for thinking about a better system.
I'm very interested in as well how we get to a political position whereby we are still globally connected and yet we're not creating universal standards. Because when you think about the material requirements for one country versus another, they're going to be completely different depending on the existing culture, but also depending on the climate and depending on what's available to them, depending on the strength of the soil. I was in the Pacific recently, and it was the last part of the world to be colonized. They still have a really, really strong historical culture. A lot of people are living, not exactly, but pretty much close to how their great grandparents were living before, the colonizers arrived. And their material footprint is absolutely tiny. And I would bet that their well being, their physical, emotional, mental well being is through the roof in comparison to a place like the United Kingdom. And what's so interesting about somewhere like that is, for example, you put solar panels on all of the houses, and a lot of them do have them, then they will be off grid. They'll be self-sufficient. They will create the energy that they need, but they probably will always need fossil fuels, just a little bit. There's no point in rolling out electric vehicles, really, somewhere like that. You could either supply people with, I don't know, like little versions of cars because the islands are tiny. They just do really short trips. And given the fact that electric vehicles require so many more critical materials, you might as well actually just keep those being fossil fuels for the next 50 years until we figure out what next to do. And so it's just these little nuances with regards to really trying to understand that people live differently. Diversity is part of what really keeps the world together. We have so much to learn from one another. And it also creates a pipeline for facilitating people to come to the decision table themselves and tell what they need, be allowed to decide what they need for themselves. Because, of course, people who come from the environment will be best placed in order to dictate what it is that they and their loved ones require. And I'm really, really interested in that because I worry a little bit with this Western sort of epistemological tradition of trying to universalize, like trying to find the mean, trying to find the average. And degrowth, especially in recent years, they've produced great research and it is helpful. But whenever I see a universal standard to be published of here's what it would take for every single person on the planet to have exactly the same things, I'm like, it's meaningless. Not every single person on the planet does need the exact same things.
Yeah, that's such a good critique. I really agree with that. It kind of reminds me also of the critique of planetary limits, which I also think are an extremely useful analytical tool to understand where we are and how much, there is left if you want, how much space there is left to pollute or whatever. But it really creates this idea that there is some space, It's like we create this like imaginary limit that like, oh, we can actually pollute this much and then that's fine. But then you enter the yellow zone and that's no longer fine, rather than actually, I think a much easier, even analytically, a much easier position would just be trying to minimize any sort of pollution. If you
Yeah.
don't need it, then just don't do it. Just minimize that. I completely agree with the issue of setting one universal standard. I don't think that's the way forward. But I also actually fundamentally believe that in this huge diversity, it's actually the vast majority of the people that would fall in the category of living within the planetary limits.
Yes.
So what I'm really advocating for is starting with the 1%. Let's first of all get rid of all the private yachts and private jets and the extremely polluting consumption of the top 1%, the extremely polluting consumption of the militaries for which we don't even have enough data. Let's start with those industries that are actually the most polluting, and then we can move to focusing on changing the lifestyles of the majority of the population. I can already hear a critique. Someone would say that this is, not sort of preemptive political action, kind of waiting for something to happen, as in we first need to do something and then we focus on something else. I still think that we can do both at the same time. I really think that, I can also choose not to use AI. I also think that like this classical discussion between individuals and systems, which sometimes gets too complicated and really, we heard it many, many times. To me, the difference really is making sure that I try to consume as little as possible within reasonable limits, while also, most importantly, I create pressure on those who are the most polluting and the most destroying to stop that.
Yeah. The new leader of the Green Party in the United Kingdom was on television the other day, and he said, he was like, listen, I'm a vegan and I don't fly and I barely consume. But let's get a couple of things straight. I do that so that I can't be branded a hypocrite. But I'm not kidding myself that that's what actually needs to happen. Like what we really need to be focusing is on the corporations and the industries and the 1%. And I was like, good for you. Yeah, that's smart. That's a really, really, really clear message. I do this so you can't come for me, but I'm still coming for you.
Very well put.
Obviously I agree with you. And I have to say, I find the whole like individual change versus systems change so incredibly dull. And because there is an element of it that is meaningless. It's both and individuals are always exist within a system and a system is made up of individuals. And the fact that we even started to kind of like worry ourselves about this distinction, I think was probably some very clever propaganda campaign, likely beginning with BP's personal carbon footprint campaign, which offset responsibility. But ultimately, what your paper says and what every scientist I speak to says is there has to be an absolute reduction in what we are consuming and what we are demanding of Earth. We've overshot her boundaries. I prefer the word boundaries to limits because I think it allows people to envision their own boundaries being crossed. Because it's not okay if someone crosses your boundaries a little bit, it's still not okay. It still doesn't feel good and you still want them to stop, like there is a wiggle room, but it's never sort of acceptable. And I just desperately want to see the political narrative become more grounded in material reality. And I love that we have this phrase in English, material reality. And I'm very worried about the continuing obfuscation of the discourse into security, the concepts like security, everything you've mentioned, security, digitization, footprints, even well-being, as a concept. Obviously, it's one of those that I back, but I just think that it gets harder to tell lies when the data points that you're playing with or the words that you're using are actually grounded in reality, and that is in Earth's bodies, in our bodies, rather than rooted in concepts like growth or GDP.
One thing that gives me a lot of hope in terms of things that are already shifting is really this resistance of the local communities on the ground, resisting mining of critical raw materials in particular, but all the other mining and all the other forms of environmental injustice. I find it really fascinating that obviously most of them, the vast majority of them, has not been co-opted by the far right. In fact, the vast majority of them is already trying to create these networks of solidarity between each other as well. One thing that I found really fascinating was an effort to create connection between resistance to lithium mining in Serbia and resistance to lithium mining in Chile, which was very obviously creating this connection across the continents with very different groups, very different kinds of people who are, however, coming together and saying that these industries are devastating for all of us and we are resisting them. So to me, that was something that that was really fascinating to witness. And of course, the effort is ongoing. Of course, there is so much more room in which you can grow, but that is something that I think is really important to pay attention to, because from all of the Gen Z protests across the world, and I mean, you mentioned the UK a few times, the efforts to really really cramp down on activism, not only in the UK, but also in Serbia, this really violent oppression of activists, anyone who supports Palestine. We've seen what was going on in the UK with the Palestine Action, of course. The massive protests against the ongoing genocide in Gaza. I find all of these movements actually to be doing the very similar work that I was also trying to do in this paper, and that is to connect all of these issues to really show that environmental destruction is connected to violence, is connected to militarization, is connected to genocide that has to be resisted. And to me, that's something that that I see as equally important to pay attention to, not to sort of fall into this trap of despair, but to see that millions of people are already resisting, and it's on us to support that and to join that.
I have found it to be a very useful frame to look at the world through the lens of resources, to make sense of different political conflicts, and so to not fall prey to believing that it's about one god versus another, or it's about one ideology versus another, because that might be how you engage foot soldiers to fight your war, but very often it's because one centralizing force needs access to the resources that exist elsewhere in order to keep growing. And that's been the case for the vast majority of recorded human history. And the fact that we study history and know history and have the books and forget it at every turn, I think speaks to the impact of the propaganda machines that facilitate, untrue discourses. But the genocide in Gaza, the genocide in West Papua, the genocide, the huge violence going on in the Congo, the genocide going on in Sudan. This is all about securing access to more materials because the world is running out of the ways and the stuff with which it built itself in the past. And holding on to that as a very clear objective fact, I think allows people to find a sense of moral clarity in all of this, and also recognize that the forces that we're up against in one place are the same forces that we're up against in another, which is why communities in resistance are facilitating networks of solidarity and are swapping strategies, because it's just very, very obvious. And the beast isn't, capitalism. And it's not the right wing, and it's not any of these concepts. It's a it's a law of thermodynamics, which is that things need to keep growing until they collapse.
I completely agree with that. And I really liked what you said about moral clarity. I think that's really important. I find it that morality has sort of become this swear word that is not really used in politics anymore because it's being, I mean, it's being used and abused. But in fact, I really believe that the vast majority of the people know what is right and what is wrong. And it's really grounding us in this material reality and grounding us, I mean, understanding the ongoing violence that I think can sort of clear out all of those clusters that you were saying of discourses that are trying to shift our attention from what is going on to something else. So to me, that's something that, yeah, as we were saying, these movements really show that actually there is no confusion. It's actually very, very clear how the genocide is connected to the destruction of the earth and to raw materials and to all of that.
Thank you, Nina. We could go back and forth on this all day because the stepping stones just keep revealing themselves by it. But I think you've nailed it. I think it's very clear. And over coffee one day, I want to know exactly how you got involved in this as well. Like, when was the first moment that you sort of saw the world through a material lens, and what did it do to you? But for now, we will leave it there. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
One person I would really like to platform is Hamza Hamouche and his work on green colonialism in the Arab region. I find extremely important in terms of all of these conversations that we're having. And yeah, a work that's very inspiring to me. So yeah, thank you to Hamza for his work, and thank you, Rachel, for your work.
Thank you for yours. I was so delighted to get the report when it came through. And I'm going to link it, Material Dependency, so everybody can go and read it and keep at it. These are the reports that we need to see more of. These are the ones that make sense of the world. So thank you, Nina, for your work. And thank you for making your time. It was great speaking with you.
Thank you so much. Lovely speaking to you too.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.